The moment those words hit the conference room, it felt like someone ripped 16 years of my work off the walls and stomped on it. Being dismissed, humiliated, and publicly labeled as the problem was never part of my job description. But that didn't stop them. They wanted me quiet, obedient, and grateful while they erased everything I built. What they didn't know was that beneath their arrogance, I still held something they depended on more than they realized. If this hits close to home, stay with me. And if you're new here, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. For most of my 16 years inside Pacific Harvest Foods, my days followed a rhythm so steady it felt like part of my bloodstream. I'd arrive before sunrise, the air still cold enough to sting, and walk the length of the processing floor with a clipboard in one hand and the weight of responsibility in the other. People joked that I could hear a malfunction in a conveyor motor before the machine itself knew something was wrong. Maybe that's true. Maybe when you spend long enough holding a company together, its pulse syncs with yours. I didn't start here as some savior. In 2009, I was just an outside consultant called in to clean up a disaster, an allergen cross-contamination recall that nearly bankrupted the company and put families at risk. Management was scrambling, regulators were circling, and they needed someone who understood both systems and consequences. That someone ended up being me. I rebuilt everything from the ground up: vendor vetting, sanitation protocols, traceability workflows, batch-level documentation. By the time the USDA completed their post-recall audit, the inspector shook my hand and said our new trail was the cleanest she'd seen on the West Coast. That wasn't luck. That was nights spent rewriting code in my living room, weekends testing new checkpoints, months teaching staff how to see risk before it became a headline. When Pacific Harvest offered me a full-time role, it felt like joining a place that valued caution, experience, and a steady hand. For a long time, that was true. My colleagues trusted me. Executives listened. And year after year, we shipped safe, clean product without a single violation. People assumed I stayed because I was loyal, but the truth is simpler. The systems I built were part of my identity. Every improved line, every error prevented, every clean audit, that was mine. I never asked for recognition, and I certainly didn't expect praise. Quiet competence was enough. The company changed around me, new faces, new technologies, new pressures, but my work remained the backbone they relied on. I trained every compliance officer who walked through our doors. I coached plant managers through their first terrifying audits. I knew which vendors tried to cut corners and which ones operated with integrity. I never thought about power. I never thought about protection. I trusted the stability helped create. And maybe that's why I missed the first warning sign. The way senior leadership started glorifying speed over accuracy. The way board meetings shifted from conversations about risk management to charts about competitive agility. The way younger hires rolled their eyes at procedures they didn't understand. Still, nothing prepared me for the moment the storm truly arrived. Nothing prepared me for the new executive whose smile was all polish and no substance, or the way she would unravel everything I'd built with a few careless phrases about modernizing operations. I didn't know it then, but the ground was already shifting under me. The life I'd built here, steady, trusted, integrated, was about to tilt toward something I never saw coming. The first time I saw Cameron Holt stride into the plant, I thought she was a consultant doing a walkthrough before a board presentation. She had that polished, overconfident posture, the kind you only get from being told your whole life that your ideas are brilliant before you've ever tested them. I didn't know she was the newly hired Director of Operational Acceleration, a title so fluffy it practically floated. I also didn't know she was the CEO's daughter, which explained the entourage of executives following her around like she'd invented sanitization itself. I was reviewing the morning sanitation logs when she stopped at my workstation, glanced at my screen and said, "Wow, you still do it that way?" No hello, no introduction, just a smirk, a shake of her head, and a tone dripping with the kind of judgment only someone with zero experience uses so effortlessly. I didn't react. After 16 years of audits and recalls and tense meetings with regulators, it takes a lot more than a smug newcomer to rattle me. Later that day, I learned she had scheduled an efficiency recalibration summit for the next morning. The title alone made my stomach tighten. Every time an executive tries to recalibrate, they're almost always talking about cutting something they don't understand. The meeting took place in Conference Room 2A, the long one with frosted glass that never quite kept sound out. 12 people were there when I walked in. Compliance officers, operations leads, quality specialists, many of whom I had trained myself. Cameron was already at the front of the room, clicking through a PowerPoint she must have downloaded on the drive over. I could tell immediately she had never set foot inside a processing facility before coming here. Her slides were textbook jargon, flow diagrams stolen from generic templates, bullet points about modernizing workflows, little arrows pointing at meaningless buzzwords like accelerated throughput and lean adaptive cycles. She had no clue what any of it meant. What struck me wasn't her ignorance, it was the confidence with which she wielded it. "We're going to streamline outdated checkpoints," she announced, flipping to a slide titled Identifying Legacy Friction. My chest tightened at that phrase. Legacy friction. It was the same insult she'd thrown at me earlier without saying it directly. I stayed quiet until she landed on the slide that changed everything. The one where she proposed removing 3 of our core safety protocols: allergen verification, sanitation sequence audit, and outbound batch reconciliation. My mouth went dry. Those weren't ornamental steps. They were the thin line between safe food and national recall. I raised my hand. "Cameron, those checkpoints were added after the recall. Removing them increases cross-contamination risks and violates FSMA traceability requirements." Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it sharpened. "Aubrey, I appreciate your passion, but we can't build an entire operation around fear-based thinking. We need to think like modern producers." I wanted to laugh. Fear-based thinking? Fear's what keeps people alive. Fear's what prevents children from ending up in hospitals because a company didn't care enough to check allergens properly. But I didn't argue. Not yet. The real inciting betrayal came 10 minutes later when she pulled up a chart that supposedly proved my systems were slowing production by 8%. "This," she said, gesturing to a red bar on the screen, "is what's holding us back. Old systems, old processes, old mindsets." And then she did it, the moment that flipped everything sideways. In front of the entire room, with half the staff I'd trained staring at me, she said, "We can't keep letting the old guard dictate the pace. Experience is fine, but at some point it becomes resistance." A soft murmur rippled through the room. My face burned. The humiliation wasn't just the words. It was how effortlessly she'd used them. Not as an observation, as a weapon. She wasn't trying to improve the company. She was trying to erase anyone who reminded her she hadn't earned her position. I kept my voice steady. "Experience prevents mistakes that cost lives." She tilted her head, smiling like she was humoring a child. "Or it prevents innovation, depends on how you look at it." And with that, she moved on. Just moved on, like she hadn't just rewritten my entire career as an inconvenience. When the meeting ended, people avoided my eyes, not out of malice, out of fear. They'd seen enough executives come and go to know the dangers of being associated with someone a CEO's daughter had just labeled obsolete. As I walked back to my workstation, I felt a chill settle under my skin. Not anger, not yet. Just the unmistakable warning that the storm had officially arrived, and it had my name written all over it. 2 days after that meeting, Cameron sent out an all-staff email with the subject line, "Operational Evolution Rollout Phase 1." I stared at the words, already feeling my pulse climb. Her plan went live immediately without any regulatory review, without any verification, without any of the safeguards we normally used before touching systems connected to food safety. I watched the changes hit our internal platforms one by one. The allergen verification checkpoint I built after the 2009 recall? Disabled. The sanitation sequence audit that kept cross-contact risks in check? Shortened to a quick visual confirmation logged by a single staff member instead of a 2-step sign-off. The outbound batch reconciliation, the document trail that ensured the right product left the facility with the right labels, reduced to a 5-second checkbox. It felt like watching someone remove seatbelts from every car because unbuckling takes too long. At first, I tried to tell myself I had seen worse. I'd lived through the recall that nearly destroyed us. I knew chaos better than anyone. Maybe this was just growing pains. Maybe Cameron would realize the consequences before something irreversible happened. But then the vendor alert started. The first was an email from a supplier we'd approved under Cameron's new, streamlined onboarding process. They had submitted allergen control documentation, but the format looked off. When I dug deeper, I realized it wasn't off. It was falsified. The certificate number they provided belonged to an unrelated facility in Nevada. Ours was located in Idaho. I flagged it to Cameron immediately, sending her the documents and the discrepancy. Her reply came back within minutes. "Let's not jump to conclusions. I'll schedule a follow-up meeting with the vendor." A follow-up meeting, not an audit, not a suspension, just a talking to, as if misrepresenting allergen protocols was an accidental typo instead of a federal violation. The second issue arrived barely 48 hours later. A different vendor, also fast-tracked under her new process, was claiming completion of a sanitation validation they had never passed. I confirmed that through a contact I had at a sister plant. Their signature on our paperwork wasn't just inaccurate, it was impossible. When I forwarded the finding to Cameron, she replied, "Focus on solutions, not obstacles," along with a polite reminder to embrace operational agility. I printed her emails and slid them into a folder I'd started keeping in my bottom drawer, each page a small record of negligence she'd eventually wish she hadn't signed her name to, but it didn't stop there. Production floor incidents began trickling in. A mislabeled batch of granola bars that almost got shipped with the wrong allergen warning. A sanitation cycle skipped because the visual confirmation looked clean enough. A batch record that didn't reconcile because 2 pallets had bypassed the final check during a shift change that Cameron said would benefit from fewer bottlenecks. Each time, I documented. Each time, I approached Cameron professionally, calmly, hoping she'd realize the direction she was barreling toward. But she didn't flinch. In fact, each time I raised a concern, she grew more dismissive. "Aubrey, we can't micromanage every little thing," she said at one point. "We have to trust the process." The irony nearly choked me. Trust the process? I was the one who built the process she dismantled. I didn't trust the new one because there was nothing there to trust. The following Monday, I sent a formal risk assessment report to Elaine Holt, the CEO. I laid out everything in careful, neutral language: dates, findings, documentation, potential regulatory violations, and recommended corrective actions. I didn't mention Cameron by name. I didn't need to. The timeline spoke for itself. Elaine didn't respond that day. But late that afternoon, Cameron appeared beside my workstation without warning, as if she had floated in on a cloud of rehearsed confidence. "Going to the top isn't how we build team alignment," she said quietly, her voice soft but edged like a blade. "If you have concerns, bring them to me." "I did," I replied, multiple times. She smiled, a thin, tight expression that reminded me of someone sealing a box they planned to bury. "You need to stop creating friction. We're evolving, and some people just can't keep up." I understood exactly what she meant. She wasn't warning me. She was marking me. And suddenly, the unease in my chest hardened into something heavier, something sharper, something that told me the unraveling had only just begun, and I was no longer dealing with incompetence. I was dealing with ambition armed with authority, aimed directly at me. The real unraveling didn't come in one dramatic explosion. It arrived in small, stomach-tightening moments that spread through the plant like hairline fractures, nearly invisible until they threatened to split everything wide open. The first fracture hit on a Thursday morning during our routine batch review. I was going through the order queue when I noticed a production line had recorded 2 different allergen classifications for the same product. One listed, "contains almonds," the other, "no tree nuts present." My heart stalled. An incorrect allergen label doesn't just lead to customer complaints, it can kill someone. The old system would have flagged the mismatch long before it came anywhere near packaging. But Cameron's streamlined process had removed the verification layer that caught exactly these inconsistencies. When I questioned the line supervisor, she told me she'd tried to pause the batch, but Cameron's new performance targets discouraged interruptions. She said I was overthinking it, the supervisor admitted, her voice wavering. She told me to stop slowing everyone down. I fixed the batch myself, digging through the digital trail to reconcile which formula had actually been used, and logged the near miss in my documentation folder. Later that afternoon, while I was still trying to settle my nerves, a sanitation tech came to me with another problem. The overnight crew had skipped an enzyme test on a mixer because, without the audit step, no one was assigned to verify it. It looked clean, the tech said, but you know how residue works. You can't see it until it's a nightmare. I did know, too well, another near miss, another incident Cameron dismissed as inefficiencies will iron out. 2 warnings in a single day weren't coincidences, they were symptoms. Friday morning brought the breaking point. I received a call from our retail distribution partner asking why 2 pallets of product had arrived without the standard outbound batch documentation. My throat tightened. The reconciliation step Cameron had gutted wasn't just weakened, it had failed. I checked the system and found the pallets had been cleared based on a single unchecked box, without confirmation logs, without traceability data, without any of the protections that kept our supply chain clean. If something had gone wrong with that batch, and we wouldn't know without documentation, we would have had no way to pull product, no way to track it, no way to protect families who trusted our labels. I took a deep breath, printed every piece of evidence I had, and walked straight to the CEO's office. Elaine wasn't there, but her assistant asked me to send the details in writing. I returned to my workstation and spent the next hour assembling the most detailed, carefully worded risk memo of my life. I explained the allergen inconsistencies, the skipped sanitation testing, the documentation failure, and the increasing vulnerability in our traceability chain. I kept emotion out of it, just facts. Facts that pointed to a simple truth. Pacific Harvest Foods was veering dangerously close to a regulatory disaster. When I hit send, I felt a flicker of relief. Short-lived, but real. Someone had to listen now, except they didn't. That afternoon, Cameron summoned me to a meeting. She closed the door behind us with the gentle finality of someone about to deliver a verdict they'd already written. "You're creating panic," she said. "You're undermining confidence in leadership." "I'm reporting compliance risks," I answered, refusing to lower my eyes. "Real ones." She leaned in slightly, as if sharing a secret. "You either get on board with the new direction, or you risk becoming the reason this transition fails." That was the moment something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. She wasn't just ignoring the cracks in our systems. She was willing to let them widen as long as it made her look decisive. And that meant the consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were inevitable. And I knew I wasn't going to wait around to be the scapegoat when everything finally broke. The email announcing the all-hands meeting landed in my inbox early Wednesday morning with a subject line that told me everything before I even opened it. Alignment and expectations, mandatory attendance. I'd sat through enough corporate alignment sessions to know that whenever executives used vague language, someone was about to be sacrificed. I just didn't expect they'd choose me so openly. The meeting took place in the largest conference room, the one usually reserved for auditors or investor tours. When I walked in, every seat was already filled. People I had mentored, people whose first compliance reports I had corrected, people who used to greet me with trust. They all sat stiffly, eyes flicking away as if looking at me might draw fire in their direction. At the front of the room stood Elaine Holt, perfectly composed in a charcoal suit, and beside her, Cameron, glowing with the confidence of someone convinced the outcome had already been sealed in her favor. Elaine opened the meeting with a polished speech about modernization, efficiency, accelerated timelines, and the new chapter Pacific Harvest Foods was entering. Every sentence felt like a narrowing hallway. Then her tone tightened. "However," she said, pausing just long enough to make my stomach coil, "change requires unity. It requires trust in leadership and alignment with our strategic direction. Her eyes locked on mine with a clarity that silenced every thought in my head. Recently, concerns have been raised in a way that undermines this alignment. A pulse of heat crawled up my neck. She continued, "Some individuals have chosen to escalate internal matters externally and create unnecessary fear about procedural improvements." The room went still. I felt 20-something pairs of eyes shift toward me, not boldly, not openly, but with the quiet dread of people watching the floor drop out beneath someone else. Elaine gestured toward Cameron, inviting her to speak. Cameron stepped forward, wearing that polished, immaculate smile I'd come to recognize as her version of a threat. "We welcome feedback," she began smoothly. "But resistance disguised as concern stalls progress. It prevents us from being competitive. It breeds hesitation in a workforce that needs clarity." She paused, letting the implications settle. I was the hesitation. I was the resistance. I was the obstacle. Then she delivered the blow with a softness that made it sting even more. "Moving forward, we expect every team member to support leadership decisions without hesitation. That includes acknowledging when our direction has evolved beyond older practices." Older practices, older systems, older people. I could hear the subtext even if she never said the words. Elaine stepped in again, her voice firm, practiced. "Aubrey," she said, addressing me directly now, "we need you to affirm your support for Cameron's leadership and apologize for bypassing proper channels. Once you do so, we can move forward together." A hush fell so heavy I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. They expected me to stand there, apologize publicly for trying to protect the company from its own negligence, and bow to the woman dismantling everything I'd spent years building. My chest tightened, not with fear. Fear would have been easier, but with the sharp ache of betrayal. I scanned the room, searching for even one supportive face, but all I saw were lowered eyes and stiff shoulders. People weren't avoiding me out of cruelty, they were terrified. Speaking up for me would paint a target on their backs. I understood that. I didn't hold it against them. Slowly, deliberately, I stood. I felt the weight of every second stretch across the room. "I understand," I said, my voice steady. Elaine's expression softened just slightly. "Do you agree to support—" "I understand," I repeated. Not yes, not apology, just understanding. Understanding exactly who they were, what they valued, and where I stood. And then I did what none of them expected. I walked out, not fast, not flustered, but with a calm that came from a place they couldn't see. Because while they believed they had stripped me of authority, they didn't know about the contract I had kept buried in my bottom drawer. They didn't know that everything they depended on was about to slip out of their control. And as the door closed behind me, I realized something important. Humiliation was the last thing they would take from me. The next thing would be power, and I was the one who held it. The moment the conference room door closed behind me, the humiliation I'd been holding together like cracked porcelain finally gave way. Not into tears, not into panic, but into a cold, focused clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't return to my workstation. I didn't speak to anyone. I walked straight to my office, shut the door, and pulled the bottom drawer open. There it was, the manila folder I had kept tucked away for more than a decade, its edges softened from age. I slid the documents out carefully, almost reverently, because I knew what they represented. The parts of my career I had built before Pacific Harvest ever saw my value. The contract dated back to 2010, right after the recall. Back then, I wasn't an employee yet. I was an emergency response consultant brought in to rebuild the company's entire traceability infrastructure. I remembered the negotiations vividly. The company was desperate, regulators breathing down their necks, and I wasn't about to let them rush me into a sloppy agreement. I insisted on a clause that most executives ignore because they assume consultants are replaceable and grateful. Section 14, subsection B. The consultant retains exclusive ownership and licensing authority over proprietary algorithms, structural design frameworks, and automated traceability workflows developed independently during the contract period. It wasn't buried, it wasn't hidden. It was right there in black ink, signed by the CEO at the time, and never altered, nullified, or renegotiated when they converted me to full-time. Why? Because they needed me more than they cared about paperwork. And now, that oversight was about to become my leverage. I spent the weekend in my kitchen, surrounded by old laptops, printed code versions, version logs, and archived backups. While the rest of the world slept, I reconstructed exactly which parts of our current operations still depended on the architecture I had built 12 years earlier. It wasn't small, it wasn't niche, it was everything. The allergen tracking algorithm that flagged contamination risks, the sanitation logging sequence that validated whether a line was safe to restart, the supplier assurance module that confirmed documentation authenticity, the outbound traceability engine that created the digital batch footprint. All of it was rooted in the original framework I designed when the company was on the brink of collapse, and the licensing for every one of those systems passed through me. By Sunday night, I'd finished drafting a clean, professional, legally airtight licensing update for Ridge Lane Systems, the consulting company I technically still owned, quietly dormant but never dissolved. No emotion, no revenge-laced wording, just a formal revision stating that core components required renewal authorization. Monday morning, I didn't go in. I brewed a pot of coffee at home, opened my laptop, and logged into the administrative backend through credentials only a handful of people still remembered I had. One by one, carefully and methodically, I changed the licensing status from active to pending renewal. Not disabled, not broken, just locked behind a gate only I had the key to. The first error message appeared on the plant dashboard within minutes. License verification failed. Contact Ridge Lane Systems for renewal authorization. I sat quietly, sipping coffee, watching the system notifications ping across my screen. First a trickle, then a steady flow. By Tuesday afternoon, their traceability reports were failing. By evening, sanitation validation logs weren't generating. By Wednesday morning, half the production line had shifted into restricted mode, unable to run without the documentation workflows that had always lived behind my code. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt balance. They had taken my dignity in front of the entire company. Now I was simply reclaiming what I had always owned, and I knew it was only a matter of hours before my phone rang. The call came at 9:12 a.m. on Wednesday, right as I was pouring my second cup of coffee. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the panic in the voice the moment I answered. "Aubrey, this is Elaine. We need to talk, now." She didn't sound like the composed CEO who had lectured me about alignment. She sounded like someone trying to keep a dam from bursting with her bare hands. I let her speak first. "Our systems, something, is wrong. The dashboards aren't generating. The traceability chain is failing. Sanitation logs aren't validating. IT says everything is tied to a licensing conflict connected to your old consulting company." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let those words hang there, let her hear the weight of what she'd dismissed. "Yes," I said calmly. "The systems you depend on were built under my consulting contract, and the licensing under that contract is still active." She exhaled sharply like she'd been punched. "We can't run production," she whispered. "USDA is already asking questions. If we can't provide documentation, they could shut down the entire facility." Her fear wasn't exaggerated. I knew exactly how fragile their position was. Without proper documentation, even one mislabeled pallet could trigger a statewide recall. "This wasn't what I wanted," she rushed on, "but we need your help. Tell me what it will take to get everything back online." I could almost picture her in her office, papers scattered, staff scrambling, Cameron pacing somewhere in the background trying to spin this as anything other than what it was. A consequence. "I'll send over a contract," I said. "Ridge Lane Systems can perform emergency recovery and ongoing maintenance." She hesitated. "What kind of contract?" I didn't sweeten it. "Standard consulting rates. Emergency response is $400 an hour. Monthly retainer is $8,000. 6-month minimum. She barely breathed for a moment. Then, fine, send it. But I wasn't finished. And one more thing, I added. Going forward, any operational changes, especially those affecting safety protocols, require written review and approval from me. Silence, a deep, heavy silence. Then, slowly, understood. When we ended the call, I drafted the contract and sent it through. 10 minutes later, she signed. I didn't return to the plant as the employee they had dismissed. I arrived that afternoon through the front entrance, visitor badge replaced with a consultant tag, and walked past the same people who had watched me be humiliated. Their expressions were different now, not fearful, not pitying, but something closer to relief. Because when systems fail, people remember who once kept them whole. Cameron wasn't in the hallway. She wasn't leading meetings. She wasn't dazzling anyone with slides she didn't understand. I found her in a conference room with her head in her hands, staring at a screen filled with error messages she couldn't explain. She looked up when I entered, cheeks flushed. "This wasn't my fault," she whispered, a line people like her cling to when consequences finally arrive. I didn't argue. Some lessons aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be experienced. I spent the next 2 days restoring system functionalities one by one, each module unlocking only after proper licensing validation, not out of spite, out of professionalism, out of pride, out of the knowledge that the work mattered, even if the people in charge hadn't. When the last system finally came back online, Elaine approached me with a tentative gratitude I'd never seen in her eyes. She extended her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. I shook it, not as her subordinate, as the expert she now understood I had always been. When I left the facility that evening, the sky was streaked with orange, one of those rare Portland sunsets that makes everything glow. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt equal again. They had tried to diminish me, to silence me, to replace me with someone who valued speed over safety. But in the end, they came back to the one truth they couldn't erase. I built the foundation they stood on, and I knew how to reclaim it when they forgot. I've learned that there's a fine line between endurance and erasure. For years, I thought staying quiet, staying steady, staying loyal was the right thing to do. I believed that if I just worked hard enough and kept proving my worth, people would eventually see it. But the truth is, in corporate America, competence can make you invisible just as easily as it can make you invaluable. When people stop appreciating experience, when they start calling caution fear and wisdom resistance, it's not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their insecurity. And sometimes the most painful lesson is realizing that loyalty to the wrong people can become disloyalty to yourself. I didn't go looking for revenge. What I wanted was respect, fairness, and a voice. But when those were stripped from me in front of an entire room, I had a choice: stay silent and vanish, or reclaim the power I had earned through years of work. My retaliation wasn't about destroying anyone. It was about restoring balance. Cameron faced the consequences of her own shortcuts, and Elaine faced the consequences of trusting the wrong person. That was enough, because sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. I've come to believe that you don't always need to burn the house down to make your point. Sometimes you just need to shut off the lights long enough for people to realize who built the wiring, and that applies far beyond my story. Maybe you're dealing with someone who keeps dismissing you, undervaluing you, or walking over your boundaries. Maybe you've convinced yourself that your patience will be rewarded. But here's the truth. People treat you the way you train them to. Value your expertise, protect your work, and when someone tries to diminish you, don't argue. Just let natural consequences speak. How to get started today. Set one boundary at work that you've been avoiding. Document your contributions. I mean, really track them. Revisit one old talent or skill you've let others overlook. Take one small action that puts your self-respect first. If this story hit home, tell me in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support means more than you know.